Welcome back to School of the South Part 2. Before we move forward, let's just summarize some of the things we've seen in the last section and how they relate to earlier regions and movements that we've studied in the class. So first, let's think about this School of the South in relationship to the Mexican muralists. There's a similar movement going on, right? And we saw that in Brazil too, where in order to form this new nation, and we're in the late 19th century, early 20th century, when this idea of how to create a modern nation state is really taking hold. So moving out of the colonial period, the Mexican muralists and the Mexican state in general are looking back to antiquity, Mesoamerican antiquity, to the Inca, to the, not the Inca, to the Maya, to the Olmec, to the Mexica, and really formulating their vision for who they want to be from those ancient, powerful ancestral roots. In Brazil, rather than looking back to a particular set of people, we saw how the avant-garde there, Andrade in particular, looked to this colonial image of Brazil as these cannibalistic heathen out in the wilderness and reappropriated that slur, right? Instead of cannibals being used as a slight, he took it to say, yes, we are, and we will eat the very best of what's produced in the world and digest it, work it through, and come up with something that is all our own, something that is new, something that is truly Brazilian. Torres Garcia is doing something slightly different, still looking back to the early classical period of South America in particular, Uruguay specifically, and working to resolve these broad, seemingly timeless dichotomies. He is flipping the map, right? Flipping the grid to say we will look to ourselves, we will look to our own history, we will look to the universals that make us the people that we are from the ancient times to the modern times. In doing that, however, he is drawing on a series of very contemporary references. So what we're going to do in this section is look at some of those references, and they range from the art of the avant-garde in Russia to the art of the avant-garde in Europe, and then, like the Brazilians, Torres Garcia and the School of the South are doing something radically new with these existent forms of avant-garde art. Okay, what are those forms? We're going to be looking at constructive art, or what's known as constructivism, or Torres Garcia, of course, in Spanish is calling it arte constructivo. So take a minute with this image. Very different art than what we've looked at before, right? There's very little that's figurative. There are recognizable angles, forms, geometry, but we're not seeing human figures, right? We're not seeing this illusionism of trying to create the idea of 3D space in a single flat canvas. Instead, constructive art it's got a very different aim. It's aiming to do something entirely different with the canvas, with the viewer, and with paint. So I'm posting a video for you to watch on constructive art in Russia, Soviet constructivism. Please watch that carefully because it gives you the groundwork for what Torres Garcia is drawing on. After you've watched that, come back. Okay, as you learned from the video, constructivism developed from Russian futurism in a way and the counter reliefs of an artist named Vladimir Tatlin. And we're looking at Tatlin's art here on the left. Take a minute with this. If you saw it in a museum, what's your gut reaction? And in the context of our class, what in the world is this? What is this thing about? So this corner relief from 1915 was highly controversial when it first was shown in galleries. It pegged Tatlin as a radical sculptor. And you can understand why in a way, right? This is not how art has looked before. It hasn't looked like this mashup of wood and metal and wire and maybe even part of a hammock that's stretching from one wall to another, almost like found pieces of a bas-relief. Excuse me, not of a bas-relief, found pieces of art. Things that are going to come up later in North America are already being presaged here. So, what is the aim? What is this kind of art trying to say? If we think back to the muralists that we saw in Mexico, who are trying to tell a story over the space of a wall, or even to, as you'll see in the next slide, a more classical or kind of 18th, 19th century form of painting. Tatlin is trying to get away from that illusionism that we were talking about, this creation of an artificial 3D image on a flat plane. Excuse the puppy squeaks in the background. And is instead trying to create actual 3D space with the art, right? So here, Tatlin's sculpture, the corner relief, it's moving from one wall to the other. It depends on the actual world that the viewer is standing in, the room the viewer is standing in, the lighting, as you can see from the shadows on the wall. All of those things are required for this sculpture to work. It isn't the illusion of 3D space. It's actually working in 3D space. It's a 3D object. This is something crazy different. And like many forms of crazy different art, it wasn't even accepted as art in the beginning. What this piece is doing is taking an anti-idealist stance. What does that mean? If idealist art, similar to, let's say, romantic art, is trying to create a mood, a place, an emotion through ideals of beauty, probably symmetry, color balance, all the techniques that you might learn if you went to a painting class. This art is not doing that. This piece by Juan Manuel Blanes, who was a Uruguayan, a piece painted in, excuse me, the date is wrong there, it should be 1878. This piece is really showing you that construction of the illusion of depth, this romantic ideal. Here you see an historical scene, one of Uruguay after a fight for independence, right? The planting of the flag, this sort of triumphal moment, created through layering, through color work, through very skilled painterly illusionism, right? That's, Tatlin is trying to do everything that is the opposite of that. And then it's dramatically and radically different. So Tatlin, part of the constructivist, is trying to construct art in the real world. And this has a very profound political agenda. It's trying to step away from romanticism, idealism, anything seen as a little bit nostalgic, and instead enter the present enter three-dimensional space, become part of the world of the viewer. Let's see why this is political. So just take a second with this quote. Does any of this sound familiar? Let's break it down. The metaphor of constructing was an ideological factor, right? So there is a political agenda behind this, a way of seeing the world, a way of formulating the world behind this kind of art. And it wants to be more science than art, more engineering than art. It's trying to be part of the proletariat, if we want to speak in Russian terms at the time, right? Marxist, Leninist terms. It's trying to get away from these fragile, beautiful painted canvases that only the elite can buy. And you should hear the Mexican muralist echoing in this idea, even though he's Russian, right? It's a shared worldview of moving toward collectives, toward communal and everyday people, away from the elitism of art. Okay, so this is part of what Torres Garcia is looking at, this Russian constructivism, and we're using Tatlin as an example. Let's move now into Torres Garcia's form of constructivism. Torres Garcia creates what he wants to call universal constructivism. It's not particular for him to the Russian constructivists. It is a step away, different. While the Russian constructivists had an immediate political agenda, that of advancing the ideals of socialism and communism, Torres Garcia has a very different ideal he wants to advance. When Torres Garcia returned to Montevideo from Europe in 1934, after being exposed to the Russian constructivists, after being exposed to all of the early avant-garde movements in Europe at the time, he was 43 years old. And he told the press that he'd returned to Uruguay for a very particular purpose, which was to develop a wide range of activities, to lecture, to teach courses, to achieve on the walls what I have already achieved on canvas. So he is certainly aware of what's going on in Mexico when he says this. And he wants to create in Montevideo a movement that will surpass the art of Paris, right? This is that flip of the map. We don't have to look at Paris anymore for the best of art. Let's create our own schools. Something that hadn't been done in the same way before. He creates a series of magazines. We saw the frontage page for one in the School of the South declaration. Here in Removador, also featuring and edited by the Torres Garcia Taller, which is just the Torres Garcia School. He's trying to create a way of thinking that goes from art to writing to all forms of society, right? But it didn't come out of nowhere. There was the example of the Russians. There's also his prior work. When he went to Europe, when in Rome, he takes on the style of painting of the classical Europeans, but with a twist, right? This isn't that full illusionary enunciation of muralism that, let's say, the classical Italian cathedrals were painted in. When you think about Michelangelo's cathedral, for example, his ceiling, it's robustly figurative. The forms on the ceiling look like real and actual humans. This is not what's going on with Torres Garcia. In this Barcelona mural, these people are very flat, right? If we wanted to just reduce it down to slang, they're almost more cartoon-like They're closer to drawing. And this is part of that modern shift to get away from illusion, to flatten the picture plane. That's what that's called. Okay, so it's a first step in his art career. In this piece, we start to see what we will think of as, the signature moves of Torres Garcia. This framing in upcycled wood. The colors are going to be similar. Those figurative kind of goddesses on the left and right of this temple entrance, they are secondary to this rectilinear architectural gridded form. Torres Garcia moves to New York for a while, and when he does so, that city enters his imaginarium. It enters the way that he paints. We see that here. And as an artist, just fully robust, he also dresses himself in this modality that he's trying to espouse. Not always, but this is at the artist ball. You can see some of the things that we're going to know as classic moves from Torres Garcia here in his clothing, right? Symbolism, grids, things that are timeless, but also he has New York written right on him, right? Place and universalism all in one outfit. All right, here's the other art movement that influences Torres Garcia, and I'll post this video for you to watch. This is from an exhibition on the Distill movement. You don't need to know as much about the exhibition as much as I just want you to hear what the curator says about Distill. You'll know Distill best from the work of Mondrian. You've seen these things. This on the left in particular, right? These sort of primary colors. He often works with black and white, and then red, yellow, and blue. And why is that? Because red, yellow, and blue are the primary colors, right? Everything else comes from there. And what Mondrian is doing is trying to reduce art to its most essential forms. Its color, its shape, light and dark. Torres Garcia's impression on the right adds some figuration to that, right? Add some symbols. Take a minute with those, write me on Slack and tell me what those symbols are. What are they doing there? But you can, no matter what, you can see the adaptation of Mondrian's work in Torres Garcia's stained glass piece. And all of this comes down to the question of what is a grid. This might seem like it's coming out of nowhere, but Mondrian, Torres Garcia, modernists everywhere start to look at and think about the grid. Why would that be? The art historian Rosalind Krauss, art historian and philosopher Rosalind Krauss, has written extensively on the grid. She talks about this in her book, The Originality of the Avant-Garde and Other Modernist Myths. And the use of the grid in the art of the avant-garde announces, as she says, modern art's will to silence, its hostility to narrative and to discourse. What is she talking about? By starting with a grid, Mondrian, Torres Garcia, it's almost as if they're starting not on a blank slate, but on a slate with no past and no pretense to future, right? There isn't the illusion of space. There is no historical narrative. There are no recognizable images. It's just an empty and open grid. This becomes important when we think in detail about the modernist project. In a spatial sense, the grid states the autonomy of the realm of art, right? It's not tied to anything else. It's not tied to landscape. It's not tied to the home. It's not tied to institutions. It points to a flat geometrical ordering of thought, nature, paint, everything. this is what the modern mindset was. Particularly after World War I, this horrific thing that had happened globally that shocked the world. The desire was to get rid of the past, any old ideas, any old ways of thinking, and start new with something truly modern.